Okay, so I think we should make a start. So once again, welcome to today's webinar. In a moment, I'm going to pass you over to Adrienne Burgess, Joint Chief Exec and Head of Research at the Fatherhood Institute, to introduce our main speaker. I'm Jeremy Davis, Head of Impact and Communications at the Institute, and my role is very limited today. I'm just here to give you a bit of housekeeping instruction. So just to say, we'll have about 15 minutes at the end of the session for questions. So you should be able to put those into the Q&A box at the top of your screen or wherever it appears on your screen. If not, you can add them to the chat. And we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. We'll also be giving you email addresses in our presentations if any of you want to follow up anything in more depth. We are recording this session. It would work best if people can keep their cameras and microphones off during the presentations. And we will be sending you the reports and a link to the recording of this webinar as soon as we can. You can find the reports already up on our website, and Adrienne in a moment will be sharing a QR code that you can use to get to that. So I think that's everything I need to tell you. So I'm going to hand you over to Adrienne to do the proper introduction.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, so I'm Adrienne Burgess, and I just want to set today's event as webinar in context. So, starting with the Fatherhood Institute, we've been here over 20 years now, established in the year 2000. We have three areas that we work. Like many of you, but we have research, policy, and practice. We train thousands of family service workers and other people who engage with families to include fathers in their practice. The other introduction I want to make is to the series of reports into which today's The Kids Are All Right fits. We've been blessed to have had funding from the Nuffield Foundation since 2014, so that's now a decade actually, and we've been able to bring out these 6 projects. Some of them have just one output, some of them have more. They are often research reviews, but not always, and all the ones in red have got sections on analysis of big UK data sets. And they're all available on our website. Now, The Kids Are All Right is our most recent one, and there's the QR code. I'll leave it up for a while if you want to use that. So there are 3 outputs. First one, which we published in November 2023, was a research review of the UK literature on fathers and adolescents. And we mostly looked at the associations between what we called father factors, so attitudes, circumstances, psychology, mental health and so on, the father factors, and children's outcomes stretching to adolescence. The second 2 are the ones that Rebecca is presenting on today. So the main one is a super analysis of data collected in 6 of the UK's longitudinal data sets, and also she's looked at what analyses has been done of this data in published research in relation to fathers and adolescents. And the third one is she's sort of summarized the research gaps and the research recommendations from the first two reports, and that's about an easy to read third document. So who is Rebecca Goldman? So Rebecca is a very valued member of our team. She's in fact an independent research consultant, but she's also an associate of the Fatherhood Institute, and she's been with us now for a decade. She's got a really interesting background, but the two things I've picked out is that she worked in central government departments, which is absolutely brilliant for us because she does understand policy. And the Social Care Institute for Excellence was another place where she worked. For us, her expertise that she uses is in fathers in quantitative data sets and also in evidence review. So with us, she advises us on our research review methods. She is the or lead author on all of our contemporary fathers in the UK reports. She's a major fatherhood contributor to new UK cohort studies. We're lucky enough to be involved in some cohort studies, and Rebecca and I do that work. And this includes the early life cohort feasibility study, which is now known as Generation New Era, as some of you will know. Another interesting thing that Rebecca did was she led our review of the methodological literature on own household fathers and longitudinal studies which we did for the ESRC. You'll hear more of this term, own household fathers. It's one that's being used quite widely now, and we use it to refer to what are sometimes called separated fathers or non-resident fathers, or heaven forfend, absent fathers. The own household fathers are the fathers who do not live in the main household with the mother and their child. So now I'm going to pass over to Rebecca.
You're on mute, Rebecca.
So thank you very much, Jeremy and Adrian, for that introduction to our Contemporary Fathers series, to the Fatherhood Institute. So I'm going to talk today about the research gap we found in our The Kids Are All Right project, which is about adolescents and their fathers in the UK, and also in particular our review of 6 UK longitudinal studies. So my presentation is in these 6 parts. I'm going to start by looking at the gaps in the published research. That's from the research review, the first of our outputs for this project, which was published last November, just gone. Then I'll describe the aims and methods of our review of 6 longitudinal studies. I'll then go on to talk about the different components of that review, which are what data is being collected, and we'll show that there's a wealth of data there to inspire you, we hope, to do secondary analysis and include it in your analysis. Then I'm going to talk about the data collection gaps and how study design in these studies interweaves with what data is collected about fathers during their children's adolescence. And then I'm going to move on to our review of to what extent that data that has been collected has been analysed in the published literature. And I'll look at the potential for future secondary analysis of this wonderful data, and also at the gaps in the analysis of that data so far. And I'll finish, as most presentations do, with recommendations. So first of all, let's look at the gaps in the published research that have been identified in our The Kids Are All Right research review. Adrian briefly introduced this, but just to give a bit more detail, so this research review is a systematic type scoping review, as we call it, of quantitative evidence on father influences, specifically in the UK, so that makes this a very distinctive piece of work, on young people's mental health and well-being, risk behaviours and educational outcomes. And the inclusion criteria for this review, which was done in a systematic way, were quantitative, longitudinal and cross-sectional studies. And we drew on 118 publications for this review that met those criteria. The source for these publications is the Fatherhood Institute's electronic literature library, which is in EndNote and at the moment contains over 4,000 records of mainly research carried out in the UK or analyses of UK data published since 1998. And this library itself was created through systematic searches of 11 bibliographic databases, which were done twice, and also systematic screening of the abstracts. And supplementary searches continue to keep the library updated. And this is a plug here for all of you who do research reviews or who want to access abstracts and literature about UK Fathers and Fatherhood Institute. This library is available now for external users, so do contact us. So, gaps in the published research. These are the gaps that have been found through the research review. So there was very little research about the influences of fathers on young people aged between 18 and 24 years. So we also looked at young adults up to that age. For example, on occupational career choices and opportunities, how have fathers influenced this? Also, to our surprise, very few, hardly any, in fact, recent analyses of fathers and educational outcomes, almost nothing using the most recent data sets. Very little on the links between early father involvement or on father physical health and adolescent mental health and well-being, nor on intergenerational transmission of values, beliefs and attitudes, or on the impacts of co-parenting. So these are some of the big gaps that we found. We also found that most analyses, even where data was collected on father factors at more than one point or on child outcomes at more than one point, sometimes using comparable measures, most of them just controlled for the same father factor, at one point in time. So we think there's value in controlling for the same father factor at an earlier or later point in time to see when the timing of any effects may be occurring. There were also gaps in the influence of subpopulations of fathers on children and their outcomes. So own household fathers, this was a big gap. Again, surprising, because around 40% of adolescent children have an own household father. That's a father who lives separately for all or most of the time. So there was very little research on their parenting roles, behaviours, relationships or circumstances. Similarly, very little on the fathers who are sometimes called father figures or sometimes called stepfathers. Very little on global majority fathers or on young or older fathers. And although there's a big literature on adverse childhood experiences, including those which are parentally linked ones, there was almost no analysis that looked at the impact of father-specific cases, such as father substance use, father criminal behaviour, or maltreatment by fathers. It was generally done in terms of parents, even where there was probably enough data available to at least do some analysis. So I've run through the gaps in the published literature. This literature is broader than the 6 longitudinal studies which we're looking at today, although a lot of the literature is from these studies. So why do these research gaps matter? We know that data is expensive, and some people might ask, won't data about mothers be sufficient? Why do we need research and data relating to fathers? We know that resources are tight for research studies, and we know that all the studies have broader objectives than fathers. So here are 6 reasons for father-specific data. First of all, fathers are a key part of adolescents' world. This data that we're giving now to exemplify this is from Millennium Cohort Study. 59% of 14-year-old girls and 69% of 14-year-old boys in the UK reported a close relationship with their natural father, who would be a birth or a biological father. And around 40% of adolescent children have a birth father living elsewhere. At least half in contact see him regularly, half of these children in contact with their father. Secondly, there are potentially genetic, epigenetic, socioeconomic, psychosocial and environmental pathways for fathers impacting on their children. And I've highlighted genetic and epigenetic here because even where fathers aren't in contact, which is the minority of them, where their own household fathers, even the minority of own household fathers aren't in contact, these genetic and epigenetic links are still present, and also these fathers may have lived with the children previously. We found in all our research reviews, coming to the third of these now, that there are distinctive independent father effects on children. So that's independent of mother effects and also often different from mother effects in various ways. So without data from fathers, it's often assumed without evidence that only maternal effects are important as predictors of child outcomes. And if we don't control for father involvement characteristics, the mother effects that we find may represent the impact of both parents and their co-parenting. In fact, in some analyses, if you have a mother effect and then you control for father involvement, the mother effect often changes in size or even direction. And also, if you have both father data and mother data, for some studies, this can disentangle the impacts of the parent's gender and the impacts of their share of parent-child time or parenting responsibilities. So here are 6, as we see it, very good reasons to collect father-specific data as well as mother-specific data. This is also shown by this chart, which is in our research review. Thanks to Professor Stephen McKay at the University of Lincoln, we've extended the data analysis here to ages 14 and 17, which Stephen did for us specifically for this project. And you'll see that although 53% of children have an own household father, a father living elsewhere by age 17, 85% of these children at age 17 are either living with or in contact with their birth father. So that's quite a phenomenal amount of contact there with fathers. Fathers are rarely missing, even at age 17. So I hope that slide speaks for itself. So now I'm going to go on in more detail about our review of 6 UK longitudinal studies. So having established that it is important to have father data as well as mother data, we looked at 6 studies. These were ALSPAC, the Millennium Cohort Study, Growing Up in Scotland, the first and second longitudinal survey of young people in England studies, which we refer to as the LSYPE studies, and also Understanding Society, the UK Household Longitudinal Study. For those of you in the world of longitudinal research, you'll see here that there are different types of studies. So ALSPAC, MCS and Growing Up in Scotland are birth cohort studies. They followed children from birth throughout childhood and into the adult years. The LSYP studies are adolescent cohort studies. They followed samples of teenagers through their teenage years and into young adulthood and beyond. And Understanding Society is a household panel study. It's representative of households in the UK, following the people in those households through the years. And in our report, we cover how different features of these studies and their legacies from earlier sweeps, and also their funding sources and broad objectives, influence the data collected. So we don't ignore that, but we can't focus on that much in this presentation. As many of you will know, longitudinal studies and data from these studies is the best data for establishing cause and effect relationship between father factors and children's outcomes, and also for a lot of other research. Just a couple of definitional issues. When I speak about fathers in adolescence, I mean fathers during their children's adolescence. I don't mean adolescent fathers, young fathers. And when I talk about fathers, I'm talking about a wide variety of fathers in their relationships to their children. So most of them will be birth or biological fathers, but there are also stepfathers, adoptive fathers and foster fathers. And our work covers all of those fathers. So just to go over now the aims and methods of our review. This is divided into 2 parts. First of all, a review of the data collected, and secondly, a review of the data analysed. In a review of the data collected, we looked at the questions that were asked about fathers to fathers, mothers, children, and occasionally teachers. And we did this to identify the potential for secondary analyses, data collection gaps, and the implications of study design to inform future research. And we did this by a desk review of research instruments, so questionnaires and interview schedules, and also technical documentation, including interviewer instructions where we could find them. And during the writing of the report, we made some clarification queries to study teams. In the second half of our review, this was a review of the data analysed in published research. And we did this to see what data has been analysed to date and identify gaps to inform new secondary analyses. And to do this, we compared the content of published analyses of these 6 studies in the Fatherhood Institute's literature library. And we compared that to the range of questions asked that we had found during the review of the data collected. So that tells us where data has been collected, that is where questions have been asked, but the data from those questions has not yet appeared in published analyses, or at least those in the Fatherhood Institute's literature library, which we think is a very good collection for all the reasons we started with of UK fatherhood literature. So first of all, let's start with the data collected about fathers during their children's adolescence. We want to go through this in brevity, but in our report there is a lot more, as you'll see. So please do use our report as a lookup resource if you're considering using data about fathers from these longitudinal studies. In fact, there was so much data that had been collected in at least one study that we have derived our own framework for structuring and looking at the different types of questions that have been asked. And we call this the Kids Are All Right Father Factor Framework. This framework consists of 7 broad areas of questions that have been asked. It doesn't cover all the questions that could be asked about fathers during their children's adolescence, but it covers the ones that we found have been asked in this set of 6 studies. So the first 3 are derived from Michael Lamb's important work on father involvement with their children. And this has its own 3 subcategories: direct engagement, that is between the father and the child, focusing on the quantity of that engagement, the frequency, the amount of time, etc. Second, accessibility, that's really about the father being available. You could say it on call to their children for practical, emotional support and so on. And thirdly, responsibility, which consists of Pleck, who worked with Michael Lamb, derived 2 categories there: indirect care, where the father carries out tasks for the child when they're not with the child. So that could be, for example, attending meetings at school with teachers without the child present, or paperwork or shopping or whatever. And process responsibility, which is kind of directing the all of that, basically, what the child's needs are and making sure that the child's needs and resources are there. Some people talk about mental load, and that's all part of that as well, the worry and the project planning and so on. So apart from Lamb's 3 categories, we extended that with 4 more. We looked at the father-child relationship, including parenting style. We put parenting style with the relationship, but some aspects of parenting style also go with responsibility, like parental monitoring of the child, of the adolescent child. Then there's co-parenting, which is where parents living apart or living together co-parent. They work together to raise their child, or not, as the case may be. Fathers' parenting related beliefs, feelings and attitudes. And we also looked at those contextual factors which derive from the father or the parental couple. So a lot of our work around what data was collected used this framework. We also, in our report, looked at the characteristics of fathers, including demographics, health and so on, in a bit less detail. So if you're interested in that side of it, it's also worth looking at our report. So the other issue that goes through our work is, who is the informant when we're gathering father data? Who is the data about fathers, father-child relationships and co-parenting collected from? It could be collected from fathers themselves, from mothers, from the adolescent children, or from other people like teachers. It's important, in our view, to have symmetrical data, both father and child perceptions of the father-child relationship, parenting time and parenting behaviours, and both parents' perceptions of the couple relationship and co-parenting. So you only get that if you collect data from fathers as well as others. Similarly, to collect data on fathers' mental health, their work details, their substance use, parenting behaviours, and specifically and most importantly, their beliefs and attitudes, you can only get most of that by including fathers in your data collection. And even factual data can be problematic for mothers to report. For example, work hours and income has been found in some methodological research. So what we did, you'll see across the top here the names of the 6 studies we looked at, from Auspeck on the left to Understanding Society on the right. And going down the rows, you'll see the row titles are those of the different main areas in our father factor framework. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there's a corresponding diagram or table in our report for co-resident fathers as well. The main thing to notice is that there's a lot of blank space for own household fathers, and a large part of that is due to these fathers not being included in data collection in any of the studies except for Understanding Society. The colour depends on the breadth of topics within each broad category, and it's not a quality assessment of the data. So in this work, we haven't looked or critiqued the actual measures, we haven't looked at the sample sizes, response bias, and so on. That's for the analyst to sort out once you've been inspired by our presentation. We did look in what had been collected in at least 3 studies, and you can read this slide yourself now. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but there really is a wealth of data to inspire you here. Just to pick out 3 or 4, there's data on emotional accessibility of fathers to their children. There's data on the frequency of own household fathers spending time with their children. Also on parenting style, with a focus on parental monitoring and control, but also data on other aspects. And there's data about fathers' educational or vocational expectations or aspirations for their child. So there's a lot there, and that's been collected in at least 3 studies. There's also a lot more that's just been collected in 1 or 2 studies. And to show you how we've detailed this in our report, I'm giving you here an extract. It's Appendix A of our main report, the review of longitudinal studies. And again, you'll see here, this takes each main area. So in this slide, you'll see father involvement accessibility. So that's one of the main areas in our father factor framework. And down the rows, you'll see some topics in that area. These are the topics for which questions have been asked in at least 1 study. Now, as I said, there are probably other topics that are also about accessibility. Some of you might think they're more important than the ones here, but we just restricted our framework to those topics where questions were asked in at least 1 study. So you'll see here that 2 of the topics have been asked pretty well across the set of 6 studies, and 2 just in Understanding Society. And do use that table as a lookup to see what data have been asked about fathers during their children's adolescence in these studies. So it's all been very positive so far, and generally it is very positive. There is a lot of data, but there are also gaps which we're now going to look at. So the gaps we found in the broad areas in our father factor framework were in father accessibility, father responsibility, fathering related beliefs, feelings and attitudes, and co-parenting as well. So these were the main areas in our father factor framework where there was less data collected. There was more data collected about direct engagement. It's easier maybe to measure and to ask about, and also about the father-child relationship. That's where there was more data collected. And again, we've already mentioned this in relation to the research review, but it was surprising to us that there was less data collection about fathers' involvement in their children's education than we would have expected, and even in studies focusing on educational and vocational outcomes. So that is one reason why there's not much literature of these more recent studies on fathers' impact on children's education, but there is data available in the MCS, in Growing Up in Scotland, and in Understanding Society about this. So go and analyse it, please, to give us a more recent picture, because the studies to date have been drawing on the National Child Development Study and the British Cohort Study. So we looked at aspects of study design which could explain some of the gaps. So the first thing is, were fathers included in data collection? And yes, they were in all 6 longitudinal studies. There was fathers and adolescents data collected from fathers, mothers, and adolescent children. In the child cohort studies, the father reported data was only from co-resident fathers. Positive was that this was with high response rates, but it wasn't collected from own household fathers. And this was because the data collection was structured around collecting it only in the cohort child's sole or main household. And that was even where the child might regularly spend overnight stays with their own household father and could be regarded as living part-time with that father. And fathers weren't included, that's the co-resident fathers now, they weren't included in all adolescent suites of any of the cohort studies except for the Millennium Cohort Study, which did do that, did interview co-resident fathers in all its adolescent suite. Only Understanding Society collected data from own household fathers, and that's really on account of it being a household panel study. Those own household fathers are among the sample of men, which is representative of households in the UK. But they also attempt to interview own household fathers who leave a sampled household between sweeps, but the attrition rate is high. And that's not just the case for own household fathers, it's the case for any adult sample members who leave a sampled household during the study. The other issue is that fathers are partner participants in a lot of the studies. So in the cohort study suites, which did interview 2 co-resident parents for each cohort child, there were various fieldwork rules either applied by the interviewers or applied in the computer interview programme, the CAPI programme, that defined the main parental research participant as the co-resident mother, either specifically as the mother or as the respondent the main respondent at previous suites, who had been the mother all the way through in the case of the the birth cohort studies. And because the mother was the main parental research participant, and I think around over 95% of those main parent interviews or questionnaires, more data was collected from the mother. And that did include questions specifically about the mother's involvement, the mother's parenting, the mother's beliefs and attitudes, for example, about the school or their educational aspirations, or about being a parent, and also about the mother-child relationship, which were not collected in relation to fathers. So instead, the co-resident father, sometimes called the mother's partner, was categorised as a partner or second parent and given a shorter interview, and less data was collected. In the LSYPE, that's the adolescent cohort studies in England, a greater proportion of main parent interviews were completed by fathers. And this is because they were adolescent cohorts, they started from scratch, and they started by asking the parent who they first interviewed, who was usually the mother, which one of you would you say is most involved in the child's or young person's education? And it was about a fifth. So about a fifth of main parent interviews were completed by fathers in those studies. And interestingly, it's quite similar to the proportion in the new Cosmo cohort of young adults who were male rather than female. So of the parents who completed data collection, it was similarly around a fifth. And there was separate analysis of that category of fathers who completed the main parent interviews. But the times are changing. So in the Millennium Cohort Study, age 17 sweep, there was an identical parent questionnaire for co-resident mothers and fathers. They completed the same questions. And in the new cohort studies that have started more recently, the Early Life Cohort Feasibility Study, Generation New Era, and the DFE Child Cohort Studies, including the Adolescent Cohort. These have set out to include own household parents in data collection, which is absolutely great, and involved us to advise on it in some cases. And the co-resident mothers, the co-resident fathers, and the involved own household parents are being asked equivalent questions about the parent-child relationship, parental involvement, child temperament in some cases, etc. Because those dads who are living separately but are very involved to date have not been asked any of these questions. They haven't been included in data collection. But even in Understanding Society, which has included the own household parents, they haven't asked them the same questions about this, about the parent-child relationship and so on, that they've asked co-resident fathers. So we think it's great that these studies are now doing that. So, other features of study and questionnaire design that we found that the breadth and the validity of the data collected about fathers in adolescence is increased when there are substantial efforts to recruit fathers with interviewer time and sufficient budgets. When questions were asked separately to children, mothers and fathers about fathers and then about mothers, not about a single category of parents. If a child has a different relationship, as they always do, with each parent, with their father, their mother, with their stepfather, with their own household father, if they have both, how do we expect them to average when they're asked questions about their parents? And also when questions are asked to children about their own household fathers, which they have been in the Millennium Cohort Study and Growing Up in Scotland. And also where questions asked about fathers differentiate between co-resident fathers and own household fathers, and between birth or biological fathers and father figures or stepfathers. So sometimes where children have a stepfather or a father figure with whom they live, and also a birth or biological father living separately, their own household father, they're asked about their father, and it's not clear which father they're reporting on. Okay, so we've gone through the data collected on these studies. Now we're going to look at which of that data have been analysed and which have not. So first of all, most analysed out of all that data was data collected about the father-child relationship, and also for own household fathers on the extent of engagement. And these aren't just analyses focused on fathers, they include analyses which are focused on all the influences on children, or on mothers, or on families as a whole. And they're using this father data as part of their statistical model analysis, quite rightly, as they should do. But least analysed was data that has been collected in these studies on the extent of father and child co-residence, including overnight stays, types of father engagement, father involvement in their children's education, father responsibility and co-parenting. You'll see those on the slide. So there's been data collected on all those things, sometimes only in 1 or 2 studies, sometimes quite substantially across the set of 6 that we looked at, but it hasn't appeared in any published analysis in our library, which we think is pretty well up to date and very extensive set of published work. And also we've seen that several analyses describe own household fathers as absent, and they define parental separation as father loss. Sometimes that's to fit in with the lingo, it's a legacy of the research area they're researching in, but it's really time to change that. And a lot of these analyses don't incorporate data about own household father that's actually been collected in the studies they're analysing. So on a positive note, these are the opportunities we see for those of you who are secondary analysts who analyse data from these studies. First of all, the data that's most recently collected. So these are about fathers of adolescents not too long ago, in the last few years, 3 to 5 years, or maybe up to 10 in case of the MCS. So the MCS has these child completed time diaries at age 14. We're not clear about how the data is to analyse, but we do see it as at least an opportunity to find out, because it codes whether the father was present with the child in a whole suite of activities that the child undertook over 2 days. There's also the recent age 17 sweep of the MCS, well, fairly recent anyway. In growing up in Scotland, there is a great set of items collected on father-child relationships, including the child's perspective on their relationship with their own household father. And there's a recent age 17 sweep. In understanding society, there's data on parenting style, and there are forthcoming developments that will improve this data. And there's data, as we said, on fathers' involvement in children's education on the impacts of own household fathers. Let's also not forget the older cohort studies, which give opportunities to look at the impacts of fathers in adolescence on adult outcomes and pathways, and intergenerational effects for the adolescent's future children. We haven't looked at the sample sizes or the data quality. As we said, that's for you analysts to go and have a look, but this data has been collected and hasn't yet been incorporated, as far as we can see, into published work. So we now go on to recommendations in 2 sets. First of all, let's look at data collection for those of you who fund studies, quantitative studies, and those of you that carry them out or direct them, who are in the teams for these longitudinal studies, or it could be cross-sectional studies. Please do collect equivalent data about father factors and mother factors in your quantitative research about children. And use our father factor framework, the Kids Are All Right father factor framework, in our report to think about different categories of father data. There's a need for balance between 2 interacting sets of factors, those that are about the father's involvement with their child, their fathering and the father-child relationship, and those which are about the father's economic activity, their income, their health and other characteristics. And out of our set of 6 studies, 3 of the studies focused almost entirely on the second set of these characteristics, which was probably in part influenced by the objectives for that study. But if you're carrying out a study looking at child development, then both sets of factors are important. Also, do collect data from both co-resident fathers and owner household fathers. And for the funders, make sure there are sufficient budgets for this, which allow interviewer time, even when collecting self-completion questionnaires or encouraging fathers to complete online data collection. The role of the interviewer has been shown to be important. As for other research participants, there's no 2-for-1 offer for fathers. It's no good just going to get the mothers and hoping fathers will tag on. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't, but you're going to improve that engagement by having targeted approaches to fathers and enough budget to do that properly. And when you do hopefully get own household fathers in your study, ask them about father involvement, fathering, father-adolescent relationships and co-parenting, as you would for co-resident fathers. And now a set of recommendations for those of you who analyse data from these large-scale quantitative studies. We ask, where there is father data and mother data, please do report evidence specific to fathers and to mothers where you can. Not for parents as a single category, where sample sizes are large enough to look at fathers and mothers separately. And please don't use the term parent as a euphemism or synonym for mothers. If your research is about mothers or has a sample or data only for mothers, then say that it's about mothers in your abstract. That's because if you use the term parent instead, you're excluding consideration of father factors, and it's masking the absence of fathers from the sample. And don't conceptualise or label own household fathers as non-resident or absent or even separated. Not all of these fathers have ever been in an ongoing relationship with the child's mother. Some of them have regular overnight stays and can be regarded as part-time resident, and only a minority of them are absent. And even those fathers will have genetic impact, and a large proportion of them are likely to have lived previously with their child, so still really important for data collection and analysis. Instead, do incorporate into analysis data collected about own household father involvement in their children's lives. And do look at the Kids Are All Right Review of Longitudinal Studies report, which we tried to summarise in this presentation for the data collected in each study. As I said, there's a big appendix at the back which sets that all out for both co-resident fathers and for own household fathers using our father factor framework. So we'll end there with this slide. You can see there the two covers of our reports launched today, and you've got another chance to use the QR code. And just to mention at the end, at the bottom of the slide, the Fatherhood Institute offers services for researchers and research funders, including our wonderful library, research reviews, interviewer training, and also, as we've had in the past, roles on longitudinal studies and secondary analysis projects. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. There, the claps are going up. Well done. Excellent.
Shall I stop sharing, Jeremy, or leave that up in case people want
you could leave that up, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, why
Okay.
not? And then people can keep using that, getting their phones to work on the QR code. Okay, so I'm looking at the Q&A section. So I can see two questions here. We'll kick off with those. Question from Christine. Do you review any research outside of the UK and include this in your reviews and reports?
Yeah, we do refer to international research reviews. So our library, as well as including UK-based research, so data and research carried out, collected in the UK about UK fathers, we do also include international research reviews of international research. And in our reports, in the Contemporary Father series, including this one, we do refer to international reviews as context. But our reviews aren't a review of reviews, if you like. There are so many other people that are doing that work. Our selling point, our thing that we do is look at UK fathers, and that is very rare actually. So we're filling a gap there.
Thanks, Rebecca. Question from Georgia. Can I ask how these 6 longitudinal studies vary in the amount and quality of data about fathers? Are there ones that are better or more limited? Well, I mean, I guess you've covered that today, but anything to add?
Well, I suppose out of the 6, the ones that have the most data across the board are the Millennium Cohort Study, Growing Up in Scotland and Understanding Society. But there are also strengths of the other data sets, the specific types of work. And so, for example, ALSPAC didn't collect much about father-child relationships or fathering, but it has got a wealth of data about fathers' health behaviours, and a lot about the couple relationship and so on. So they each have their strengths and weaknesses.
Good answer. A question in the chat, and then I can see Carolyn's got her hand up, so I'll come to you next, Carolyn. So Amar is asking, in terms of research gaps involving fathers, are there good quality interventions that have been developed that could be evaluated?
I'm going to hand over to Adrian.
Adrian, do you want to take that one?
For that one.
Unmute myself. You've unmuted me. Thank you. Yeah. Right. Yes. Well, we also keep in our library quite a good record of interventions and also scales for measuring all kinds of aspects of father-child relationships. So we do have a pretty good grasp of all that. Interventions for fathers and adolescents are few and far between. That we found none in the UK, and I've got a couple that we might think about trialing here, but most of them are with fathers much earlier on in the parenting cycle.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, Carolyn, I'm going to try and unmute you, so hopefully you can ask your question in person.
Apologies, it won't let me add anything to the chat.
Oh,
I
don't
have
worry.
tried.
It's good to hear a voice.
A croaky voice. It's just a question. Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I'm currently doing a very small study looking at fathers and intimate partner abuse and the impact that's had on their relationship with their children. I just wondered if that was an area that you have looked at previously.
I can look at this. I can reply on this because that's actually something we do mention in The Kids Are All Right. Very little of the intimate partner violence research actually distinguishes between, they'll sometimes talk about the victimized mother, and so you can kind of deduce from that the IPV has been perpetrated by the father. But actually, I was astonished in the UK research how little of that there is. There is more internationally, and I've got that stuff collected mostly, I think. But I would have to do a proper review of that to make sure, before I would claim that we had all that stuff. But yes, so the subtleties of all that, the kind of controlling behavior, physical violence, all those things, differentiating between those, looking at fathers alone as opposed to mothers, looking at, I remember reading one study which said that for children, the mother threatening to leave was incredibly damaging, whereas the father, it was through some other kind of controlling behavior. So there are the subtleties of that are very, very under researched in my view.
ALSPAC does, it's the only one, I think there are two of the set of 6 studies that collected data about partner violence, and ALSPAC does, and I think it was the MCS that did as well. And then you have both, in ALSPAC, you had both the father and the mother reporting on that, and also actually on physical and emotional abuse to the children. So that's quite unique, obviously likely to be very underreported, and a lot of, some of the parents who are doing that may not be in the study at all, but yeah, there is some data.
Good stuff. Thanks both. Okay, Paul in the Q&A is saying, thanks a million, Rebecca. Incredibly interesting and useful as always. If you could choose one research gap that you think is of greater priority than the others, what would it be? That's a good question.
It's a good question, and it's a challenging one for me, isn't it? I would say to look at the own household fathers, just because there's so little, and it's felt very disappointing that there is some data collected from mothers and from children mainly, and that it hasn't been incorporated into analysis. So it's almost like those fathers are just completely missing from the evidence base when they don't need to be.
Yeah. Good. Okay, Kim is saying, is asking, what recommendations would you have for getting fathers involved in advisory panels for research? How can we get dads involved in things like that?
It's a really tricky one. I mean, quite often the dads have no idea. You're asking them about how to connect them. Similarly, when you're asking them for services, it was a service I was looking at in Bradford, I think. They had a very established service where they were engaging with a lot of fathers. And then they asked the fathers what they wanted, and they said, oh, we want to have evening engagement. And then nobody came. It's a very, very tricky thing. I think that, not that I say that advisory panels are entirely useless, but I think that more is to be learned from the academic literature on what you need to do to get fathers involved in research. That's always where I would start at this time.
Okay, good. Charlotte, is asking about stepfathers. I'm wondering how good these studies actually are at identifying and distinguishing new entrants and people exiting from the household. So stepfathers and biological fathers moving in and out.
They're pretty strong on that because they're cohort or longitudinal studies. At the beginning of each new round of data collection, they interview one person in the household. In a household interview, one of the first questions they ask is who was here last time and who's not here now and who's joined. So there definitely is in most of these studies data on new fathers in the household and fathers that have left, both birth fathers and also father figures who have left. And in Understanding Society, I think it was the only one, there is a question asked to children about their stepfather and the quality of relationship with him.
Okay, great. Now,
what's interesting about that, just to add, is that you know, there's actually relatively few of these co-resident father figures. It's about 10 or 11% when they're sort of age 11, age 14. We haven't got the data right through on age 17 yet, but when we looked at it, as far as we could tell, there were fewer at age 17, and we think it's probably because these fathers move in and out of households quite often. The relationships are more prone to breakdown, and that with younger households, the mothers are more likely to repartner. But it's a very interesting topic and definitely warrants further research.
Could I just say on that, actually, that growing up in Scotland also asked questions to children to age 12 or 14 that can be differentiated for father figures in the household. And the other interesting thing is that the Millennium Cohort Study in its latest sweeps started asking mothers about stepfathers or father figures who had left the household. So they included among our own household fathers that they asked the mothers about those father figures who had left the household since the last sweep. So there's, you know, I don't know what the sample sizes are like, but there definitely is potential there.
Okay, just we've probably only got time for another couple. Any tips for engaging own household fathers in surveys?
Oh, wow, that's a big one, which we're grappling with now on some of the cohort studies we're working with. I think you have to target your communications right from the beginning, and you have to have it really built into the aims and objectives of the study and the budget, because that influences so much that follows in what you're actually able to do to engage these fathers. You have to have letters that really speak to these fathers and mention fathers a lot. Studies have found that self-completion doesn't work as well as face-to-face or phone interviews. So that there are lots of factors. I mean, clearly they're a tricky group just because they live somewhere else and you have to find them. So that's sometimes, you know, the first thing that you need to do. But growing up in Australia and obviously in Australia and fragile families in the US a decade or more ago, but they actually were very successful in engaging own household fathers on their child cohort studies. So yeah.
It can be done.
It can be.
Okay, right. Well, I'm gonna finish us off there, I think. I want to say a big thank you to Rebecca for leading on this groundbreaking work and sharing it with us today. Big thanks to the Nuffield Foundation for funding this work and for helping us spread the word about it to the research community. And thanks to everybody who came today. I hope you've found the session inspiring and you'll take the opportunity to dig into Rebecca's amazing reports and let them take you to a new and father inclusive place.